So this is lesson number 5 in a 6-part. I'm anticipating a 6-part series as I look at creation, evolution, the intelligent design, the debate over beginnings. And in this particular lesson, this episode, this video, we're going to be looking at the origin of the species. The last episode was about the origin of just life itself, how the spark of life could have begun out of non-living matter, the explanations for that. In this one, we're going to look at the kind of the tree of life, if you will, in a sense of, how did the variety of species come about? What do we do with the naturalistic explanation of that? What does the science, what does the data point to? Of course, we know that the scripture, the Bible says that God created the variety, the kinds, the complexities of the different species that we see. Well, how does a naturalistic or atheistic or secular explanation work relative to how all the different species came to be? As with the previous videos, I'm going to be showing you, sharing with you some videos of experts. In this case, there are going to be 2 different videos I show you, both of PhDs. So you're going to be hearing from scholars and experts and geniuses, really. And then at the end, I will do a little bit of summation and just add a couple of points, but most of this is going to be about their explanation of things. So again, I'm going to share with you now 2 successive videos, and then I'll kind of chime in at the end.
Mutation. It is the key to our evolution. It has enabled us to evolve from a single-celled organism into the dominant species on the planet.
The advent of the nuclear age may have accelerated the mutation process. Individuals with extraordinary abilities may already be among us.
Mutation is a critical ingredient in the recipe for evolution. Mutation generates variation, differences between individuals. Mutation generates variation.
Key to
Human evolution. Mutations key to evolution.
What's fact and what's fiction here? Are mutations really the key to our evolution? Think about it. In real life, significant genetic mutations don't create superpowers. They create super challenges. Sometimes those mutations are even life-threatening. That's the reality. And yet we're told that random mutations with guidance from natural selection invented and genetically engineered every feature of every living organism.
Changes to life's instructions happen more or less at random.
Mutation generates variation.
Evolutionary biologists claim that random mutations accumulating over time ultimately produce life's features. If this is the case, zillions of chance mutations over the history of life led to the invention of flight and sight, immune systems and reproductive systems, even conscious beings with the capacity to love, reason, create art, and distinguish right from wrong. However, now, we no longer have to rely on speculative claims. Through experiments, we can actually observe mutations and see what they're doing to guide evolution. Biochemist Michael Behe has spent much of his life researching and studying mutations.
In the past 50 years or so, methods have been developed to track mutations, changes in DNA at the very molecular level. Now we can watch evolution in real time.
Since 1988, biologist Richard Lenski has been conducting one of the greatest evolutionary experiments ever done.
He started a culture of bacteria called E. coli growing in his lab. And since they reproduce so quickly, now they're up past 60,000 generations. And that's like 1.5 million years of human lifetimes.
So we are talking about numbers that are big enough to see some serious changes, if serious changes could come about.
In his work, he's seen a lot of beneficial mutations come along. But turns out that the great majority of the mutations were in pre-existing genes, and they either broke or degraded the genes. So the bacteria were evolving, improving more by devolution than by evolution.
It's difficult to understand how breaking a gene can be beneficial or helpful. Think of it this way.
Suppose you had a car, and the most important thing to your survival right now was the gas mileage. What could you do to improve the gas mileage of your car quickly? One thing you could do is rip out the back seat and throw it away. Back seats are helpful, but if your life depended on you getting better gas mileage right now, that would be a beneficial improvement. The problem with that, for Darwin's theory, is that ripping the back seat out of a car doesn't tell you how you make a back seat. Darwin's theory needs to show that organisms can improve by building things, and that's what has been missing in this terrific experiment.
This famous E. coli experiment shows that trillions of random mutations are not capable of building anything new. By the numbers, this E. coli experiment is giant, but it's dwarfed by the size of a natural experiment involving humans infected with malaria.
Every year, about 1 billion or so people contract malaria. So that's 1 billion times 1 trillion cells that are made each year on the planet.
In recent decades, scientists have exhaustively studied malaria. They've seen how it evolved resistance to several of the drugs used to treat it. But what is more interesting is what scientists haven't seen.
There were no new molecular machines, no new genes, and yet it had so many chances, evolutionary theory would have predicted that you'd get something really pretty impressive out of that, but it wasn't seen.
And it's not just malaria, it's not just E. coli. The pattern is widespread. For Behe, this raises a serious red flag for evolutionary theory.
The discovery that many beneficial mutations are actually destructive or degradatory mutations puts a huge monkey wrench into Darwinian theory. Not only can't Darwin's mechanism of random mutation and natural selection build complex systems, it has a strong tendency to degrade them.
This means beneficial mutations, what we have been taught are the building blocks of evolution, show no observable capacity to build or invent.
We see that overwhelmingly the good mutations come about by breaking old genes. So you're not making something new, you're throwing out something you already had. We see it in bacteria, we see it in mammals, we see it in birds, we see it everywhere that's been looked at so far.
This scientific evidence completely conflicts with evolutionary theory, and that is why the public never hears about it. Only a few brave scientists have been willing to speak out, like Lynn Margulis. I was taught over and over that the accumulation of random mutations led to evolutionary change, led to new species. I believed it until I looked for evidence. So if mutations aren't the building blocks of evolution, what can explain the invention of new things like the cell, or the eye, or flight? In birds, we find all kinds of amazing interdependent features that appear orchestrated for flight. We know from experience how difficult it is to get a flying machine and what it takes to build one. We observe things like purpose and function coming from intelligent sources, not from blind material processes. So when we see design, engineering, and artistry throughout nature, shouldn't we be looking for a designer, an engineer, an artist capable of fashioning what we see? We are not materialists. We see the human soul. We experience love. We live with purpose. We fight for justice. We are the quiet majority, and we will be quiet no longer.
Okay, and given how quickly these complex animals arose and the absence of prior ancestors, how have the neo-Darwinian paleontologists attempted to explain the missing Precambrian ancestral fossils?
Well, as Dr. Chen alluded to, there are many paleontologists now who are acknowledging that the Cambrian explosion is a real event and that it does pose a challenge to the textbook theory of evolution that we all learn called neo-Darwinism. But there are still defenders of neo-Darwinism out there, and what they have typically proposed to explain away the absence of these ancestral forms is something called the artifact hypothesis. And what the artifact hypothesis is a kind of modified version of the idea that Darwin put forward in the 19th century, that we're not seeing the ancestral forms either because we haven't looked hard enough, or because for some reason these ancestral forms were not preserved. So the technical way of referring to that is the idea that the missing ancestral animals to the Cambrian animals that arise later, those ancestors are missing, and they're missing as an artifact of either incomplete sampling of the fossil record or as a result of incomplete preservation. Now, 150 years since the publication of The Origin of Species, and given all these different fossil finds, no one really can say we haven't looked hard enough anymore. So what people are now saying is that the fossils are missing because of incomplete preservation. And in particular, the idea that's put forward is that the missing ancestors weren't preserved because they were either too small or too soft to have been preserved. And that's the version of the artifact hypothesis that's still in currency. And yet there's been another discovery in China that has really challenged that idea. In fact, I think challenged it in a very fundamental way.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to go to next in this next clip, folks. What fossil evidence refutes the artifact hypothesis that the reason the missing links, the prior ancestors of the Cambrian animals, have not been found is because they were too soft and too small to have been preserved? I want you to watch this next clip.
The Xinjiang fossils provide the most inclusive picture of the Cambrian explosion yet documented. And directly beneath them, in Precambrian shales, another chapter in the history of life is written in the rocks.
There's another amazing find that's been made in China. Paleobiologists have discovered little tiny microscopic sponge embryos in the layers of rock just beneath the layer that documents the Cambrian explosion.
These embryos were soft-bodied animals. Some fossilized 60 million years before the Cambrian explosion.
They're eggs and embryos, which are preserved in thin crusts of mineralized material, a phosphatic material, on ancient seafloors, which suggests that the chemistry of the seawater in those days was somewhat different than it is today, because this method of preserving fossils disappears during the Cambrian, and it's not around today. So we're lucky that we have these thin crusts with little tiny fossils in them.
This is highly significant because one of the most popular explanations for the missing Precambrian fossils is that the Precambrian animals were too soft and too small to have been preserved.
Since 1999, Paul Chien has studied fossil embryos and helped develop techniques to analyze their structure.
By treating with acid, you can actually remove the rock and isolate the embryos, and then you get round pebble-like or sand grain-like samples. And then we look through some tiny little ones, larger ones up to 1 millimeter in size. And we found about the range between 500 and 800 micrometers. We have mostly sponge. And then I start breaking up these balls and try to start looking inside. And with the help of electron microscope, I was able to see the detailed subcell structure within these embryos.
Chien's work on these fragile remnants of Precambrian life raises an important question.
If these lower strata can preserve an embryo, if they can preserve a soft microscopic embryo, then why couldn't they have preserved the larger ancestral forms that supposedly evolved into the Cambrian animals? In other words, if you can preserve something as fragile as an embryo, why couldn't you, in the same strata of rock, preserve the immediate ancestor of a hard-shelled trilobite?
So the idea that the fossil record is too damaged to provide us with at least a general picture, that idea just doesn't wash.
Stephen, what we just saw is incredible, and I can remember when I was in school having professors tell me, yeah, the missing links are missing because they're soft-bodied, and the fact is there's no way to keep them in the fossil record. That just went down the tubes with that last clip. What are neo-Darwinian paleontologists now saying about what they're going to do?
Well, I think we should just talk about paleontologists and Cambrian paleontologists, because I think increasingly many paleontologists are not necessarily committed to neo-Darwinism because it has so many problems. They're committed to some form of evolutionary theory typically, but now many leading paleontologists, certainly in China, but also leading American paleontologists, are saying that whatever we make of the Cambrian explosion, however we attempt to explain it, we have to start from the premise that this is a real event. It's not an artifact of incomplete sampling. It's not an artifact of incomplete preservation. It's a real event, and it has to be reckoned with. And some of the leading Chinese paleontologists, J.Y. Chen has been very outspoken in making this point. There's a major book on the Cambrian explosion that came out in 2013 by Doug Irwin of the Smithsonian Institution and James Valentine, who was shown in that previous clip from the University of California, Berkeley, in which they make this same point. The Cambrian is a real event. We may not have a good explanation for it, but we've got to reckon on the event as something that really happened. It's not just something that is a kind of illusion from our not being able to see what happened in the lower strata. We now have good reason to think that the lower strata, or the depositional environment in the Precambrian, was capable of preserving even small and soft organisms, and therefore the absence of the ancestral forms of the larger organisms with hard parts should certainly have been there if those animals existed, if those precursors existed. That they weren't preserved is best explained by the supposition that they weren't there.
Yeah. What does this do to the neo-Darwinian theory?
Well, it certainly, again, challenges the neo-Darwinian picture of the history of life. The first complex forms of animal life seem to arise very abruptly, and it also challenges the idea that the neo-Darwinian mechanism was the mechanism by which these complex forms of life arose, because that mechanism requires a vast amount of time, and it should have left behind a vast number of failed experiments, if you will. It's a trial and error mechanism where you get lots of different of variations arising, different mutational changes arising. So we ought to see the evidence of all those failed trials in the lower strata, and they're not there. So it raises questions both about the pattern, the picture of the history of life that Darwin proposed, but also it raises questions about whether the mechanism of natural selection and random mutation is really what was at work in producing these first complex forms of animal life.
Yeah, set us up for next week, because we're going into what you really want to talk about, and that is the fact is we're getting to, in the fossil record, biologists are saying we now know a little bit about how animals are made, and that's a problem.
Well, in my book, Darwin's Doubt, I talk about two great mysteries. And the first mystery is pretty easy to comprehend. It's the mystery of the missing fossils. They're simply not there. What we'd expect to see in the in the lower Precambrian layers are not there. But I think there's an even deeper mystery. And that is the mystery that I call the engineering mystery. How do you build an animal? How would the evolutionary process build an animal, especially when you have such a compressed time scale? And that mystery has been made very much more acute by discoveries that have been made since Darwin's time, in particular discoveries in the field of molecular biology about the importance of information, digital codes stored in the DNA molecule, and the importance of that information to building animals. And as we've come to appreciate that building animals requires vast sections of digital information, essentially assembly instructions, the Cambrian explosion becomes an engineering problem. Where would all that information come from? How would it get built? Because we now know that you need that kind of information to build an animal.
Yeah. Now, folks, we're just starting to unscramble that for you, and it's a deep mystery, and Stephen is one of the world's best in explaining that, and we're going to attempt to show you what is needed in terms of information, genetic information of how you build an animal, and then we're going to ask the question, where did all of this information come from?
So again, uh, two different things. Obviously, the notion that mutations and the process of natural selection would account for the variety of the species and kinds and so forth that we see is put into doubt by the fact that mutations are overwhelmingly destructive to the organism. And basically, at least experimentally, science has seen no evidence, obviously, that this could have taken place. And then, of course, in the last video, talking about the fossil record. And as you see here, Charles Darwin anticipated the fossil record would bear his theory out. At the time that he brought forth his theory, wrote his book, The Origin of the Species, and any of his writings thereafter, the field of paleontology was in its infancy, had really just barely gotten off the ground. So, speaking of the ground, they had just barely started digging and looking for fossils. And based on his theory, this is what Charles Darwin said: the number of intermediate and transitional links between all living and extinct species must have been inconceivably great. In other words, he anticipated that as these paleontologists continued to dig in the ground, they would see lots and lots and lots and lots of basically what you might call tweeners, one species kind of evolving into the next. As Dr. Meyer said, basically trial and error, where these new species were developing from old ones, and they were, in some cases, a quarter of the way to the next species, and then a halfway to the next species, and then three quarters, and so forth. But obviously, the problem is, as this later quote says, the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory was the lack of fossil evidence, which, of course, at his time, he was anticipating, well, as time goes on, they're going to find more and more. And so he argued that the record was just incomplete at that time because paleontology had just begun. The problem is that there really has been there are a lot of fossils that have been found. Enormous number of fossils have now been dug up, and the transitional forms that he anticipated and that evolution anticipates have not been found. Today, there is no large-scale fossilization occurring. There are no new fossils. I wouldn't say no, but there aren't many. And the reason for that is, for fossilization to occur, primarily they have to have hard parts. They have to be buried very, very quickly and then stay undisturbed. Obviously, if an animal just kind of dies on the plains, the scavengers are going to tear it apart, and basically it's going to disintegrate into basically nothing. But if it is buried quickly, use an example of something like a catastrophe like Mount Vesuvius, lava coming down and burying, killing and burying living beings quickly, they would get fossilized. Or a flood, a massive flood that buries, kills and buries and leaves undisturbed living beings. Those living beings can become fossilized. This is one of the reasons why, at least biblically speaking, we point to the Great Flood, Noah's flood, as one of the primary explanations for the fossils that exist. It's buried quickly, undisturbed, and so forth. So again, that's not happening today. And the fact is that no true incontrovertible transitional form or fossil has yet been found which demonstrates one species becoming another. The fossil record simply does not bear out species becoming other species. They have found different breeds of different animals, but have found no in-between forms, different sizes of horses. I remember those from my textbooks in high school. They would show these smaller horses and then bigger horses and all the intermediate sizes and saying, see, that proves evolution. Well, not really. It's different breeds. That's like taking a Chihuahua and a Saint Bernard and lining up all the different species of dogs in between and their sizes and saying this proves evolution. Well, not really. It's breeding. They're all dogs, and none of them are in betweeners. You don't see cats becoming dogs and in betweeners. So that's a completely different thing. And really, even the few fossils which along the way have been proposed are not universally accepted, even by evolutionists, to be actual intermediate forms. And even those, I read a quote once where you could take the purported in between the transitional forms or fossils that exist and put them in a single box, basically. And even those, even by evolutionists, they have not been universally accepted. Stephen Gould, an evolutionist, by the way, said missing links are the rule. The more scientists have searched for transitional forms between species, the more they have become frustrated because, obviously, what's inferred, they have not found them. And this is really important here, this next quote. The family trees which adorn our textbooks are based on inference, however reasonable. Of course, he's an evolutionist, so he says, well, it's reasonable to put those trees in there, but they're based on inference, not the evidence of fossils. And Professor Gould is the one who came up with a theory of evolution called punctuated equilibrium. Now, if evolution occurred, it managed to escape detection via the fossil record. Okay, just another way of stating that the intermediate forms are absent. They do not exist. We have not seen them. So this lack of evidence gave rise to him and another professor coming up with a new theory called punctuated equilibrium. And that said, basically, that new species did not arise gradually over time with this kind of trial and error thing, but rather all of a sudden, one species, a bird laid an egg and out of the egg came a lizard or vice versa. That's punctuated equilibrium. There wasn't a long time of a transition between the two. It just happened like that. To me, that's like counting, they accuse us of using, God to answer the questions, miraculous supernatural things. To me, that's their version of a supernatural act. But anyway, it purports that one species merely gave birth to another all at once and for no reason, with no intermediates in between, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, there's no evidence for that. And what they would say is, well, the lack of evidence is evidence that that's how evolution occurred, because they are holding to the theory that evolution occurred. It was a natural or naturalistic, atheistic process. And if they're going to hold to that, they have to come up with some way to explain that, why this evolutionary process has escaped detection. Well, because it just happened in a simple generation. Again, believe that if you will, but obviously to me, that's as difficult to believe as it is for them to believe us when we say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Anyway, the next lesson, next episode, the last one in the series, at least I anticipate it being, going to look at man. And obviously the dawning of mankind, the quote, theory of evolution relative to mankind. And obviously that will be kind of the culmination of my series. I hope that this has been interesting to you. I know if you're not really scientifically bent, so there's a lot of kind of detail here. But even if it's not something that you would be incredibly interested in, perhaps you have a son, a daughter, grandson, granddaughter, whatever, who is in the public schools and being spoon-fed naturalistic evolution. Needless to say, none of what you heard today, or none of what you've been learning, if you've been following along the series, have they been exposed to. And that's obviously the secret, really, of the teaching of evolution is keeping the details, the actual science, the evidence um, from people, and obviously teaching a theory that has very, very little foundation. Anyway, thank you for tuning in, and I hope you'll look for the next episode. God bless you.